Hello there! Welcome to the Saroy channel wherever you are in the world. And so much love to each and every one of you. How are you doing? I do hope you're doing really well. I'm doing great, thank you very much. And I'm so delighted you've joined me for part 2 of our story. And what an exciting story it is. We know that Sharon, who shares an apartment with her roommate Freya, and her roommate has gone away for the weekend, and she was at home in the middle of the night and she got a knock from the police at the door asking her if she'd heard anything strange during the night. And when she looked out of the window, she saw a body on a gurney being put back in the coroner's van. So she knew that something quite terrible had happened in her apartment block. So we're about to find out where the story goes to from here. So before we get started, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Click the notification bell and the thumbs up, and you know I really do love hearing from you. Your comments make such a difference, not only to me personally, but of course to the algorithms on this channel. So I really appreciate them. So let's continue with our story. Sharon climbed out of the tepid bathwater, patting her feet dry on the bathroom mat and drying her whole body with a soft towel. She sashayed over to her bedroom closet to decide what it was she wanted to wear. For a long while she stood there rather absent-mindedly, with her towel still wrapped around herself, staring vacantly at the clothes in her wardrobe, almost as if her mind was 1,000 miles away. Normally such a basically simplistic decision would have been so easy to make, as choosing what to wear always came easily to Sharon. This morning her whirling mind was indecisively caught up in a blur of disorientated confusion. She thought of what had occurred downstairs, and her focus seemed to have been flung out of the window. In the end, Sharon settled for a simple pair of black leggings and a loose-fitting pink sweater, with a logo on it saying, "You go, girl." It had been given to her as a present from her sister, and was one of the most comfortable sweaters she actually owned, as it was so big and cozy, and right now big, comfy clothes made her feel cushioned in security. She padded to the kitchen, ferreting around in the freezer, pulling out a brown paper bag, where she selected a couple of frozen croissants and put them on a warming tray, which she placed in the oven, until the whole kitchen smelt toasty and delicious. Soon she was at the counter sipping warm coffee and tucking into her favourite almond-flavoured croissants, drenched in butter and jam. The sweetness of the jam seemed to soothe the rattling thoughts inside her that were becoming increasingly noisy. She put on the radio, hoping that some local news might be able to shed light on what had happened here at her Buckhead apartment block. But there was nothing to be heard, apart from a cacophony of musical hits being played over the radio, and a local report on a bridal expo, where the organizer was encouraging even people who were not getting married to come along for the ride. "If you've got nothing better to do on a Saturday morning, bring the family along, why don't you? It'll be a wonderful day out for you all. The tickets are inexpensive, and there is so much to do and see." Sharon did not like the idea of looking at bridal gowns when she was far beyond getting married herself. She had broken away from a 5-year relationship with Art, and had lost any interest in returning to a life of perennial dating. She knew online dating was not what it was cracked up to be, and half the liaisons were more about one-night stands rather than enduring, meaningful and long-lasting relationships. And at this stage of her life she abhorred anything insincere and shallow. How some people could go out with a stranger for a night of passion, to never see them again, was something that made no sense to her at all. Before the events of last night, she had planned her Saturday out really well. She had intended to go shopping in the morning for a dress to wear at a girlfriend's wedding in 6 weeks' time. Then she was going to meet up with her friend Lara for lunch. But now it felt all wrong to be doing any of that. Even popping out to a delicatessens seemed wrong. But she reminded herself that life did not stop just because someone had died. You still had to eat, shop, work, continue with your daily activities, almost as if nothing had happened at all. Every day people died, did they not? But the world still revolved around its axis, and people continued with the normal routines of their daily lives. And that is what she would have to do. She began to sift through the messages on her cell phone, and noticed that there was one from her roommate Freya Warrington. It was the most recent message that she had received at 10 p.m. the previous evening, a voice message that she had happened to overlook. Hi, is that you? Sorry, Sharon, it's me, Freya Warrington. Just to let you know, don't get a shock if you hear a noise. I'm coming back to the apartment this evening. It'll probably be after 10. I'm returning to the flat, I'm afraid. I decided not to go home after all for the weekend. I've just got too many things to do at the moment. Maybe we could do something together over the weekend. I'm free on Sunday. It would be good to get to know you better, Sharon. I know a place that does a really mean Sunday lunch. Goodness gracious me, thought Sharon, suddenly realising that her roommate Freya Warrington must have turned up last night after all, without her knowing, and was probably fast asleep in her bedroom right now. Freya must be a very deep sleeper, she thought. She must have been dead to the world, to have not heard the knock at the front door from Detective Cox. How could anybody sleep through that, she wondered. Sharon had not taken any precautions to be terribly quiet the previous night, having automatically assumed her roommate was far away in North Carolina, enjoying time with family. Yet she had not heard a dicky bird out of the girl. Should she check in on her to see that she was all right? Maybe she had made plans and gone off somewhere else, or maybe she was still fast asleep in her bed. You did hear of people who could sleep through tornadoes and raging storms and wake up in the morning knowing nothing about it. Maybe she was like that. As she was thinking about this, there came another knock at her front door. It was Detective Robert Cox at the door again, but this time the tension in his shoulders and the tightness in his clenched jaw were very discernible. The detective's back was as straight as a pencil, his posture rigid, the tone of his voice authoritative. "I'm very sorry to disturb you once again, ma'am." "Please call me Sharon. It's no problem, Detective. I was up and about anyway." "I wanted to talk to you about your roommate, Freya Warrington, if I may." "Oh, about that," said Sharon, quickly passing her cell phone over to the detective. "I'm afraid my roommate, she didn't go back home to North Carolina after all. In fact, she's just left me this message. I thought she was staying with her parents, but she's been here at the flat all the time." "She didn't?" asked the detective, raising a brow. "So she's here then. You've seen her for yourself, have you?" No, I haven't seen her in person, Detective. She must have returned home last night, rather late, so I missed her, I suspect. But it's on my cell phone. Her message, I mean. She left it after 10 p.m., saying she was returning to the apartment. But with all the noise that's been going on, I wonder why she never got up. I was about to check on her when you knocked on the door." Detective Cox looked intrigued. He studied the message on Sharon's cell phone. "You've only read this now, have you, ma'am? Freya Warrington left you this message at 10:05 in the evening last night." Sharon nodded. "Did you hear her return home last night, perhaps? Did you not hear a key in the lock?" "No, I didn't. But then I never hear her, Detective. She's very considerate like that, unlike anybody else that has shared a flat with me. I actually never know when she's in or not." "Well, do you think, ma'am, you can go and wake her up for me? It's very important for me to confirm her presence in this flat of yours." There was something about the detective's earnest yet solemn tone of voice and the look on his face that made Sharon pause for breath. Why this sudden interest in her roommate? Something about this cross-examination felt exceedingly off, and she began to wonder about her roommate's safety. Was she all right? Had something bad happened to her? Please God, no. Sharon quickly hurried over to Freya's bedroom door, her legs now wobbling awkwardly beneath her, her heart almost flouncing in her chest. She gingerly knocked on the bedroom door. And with a cracked voice she said, Freya, it's me, Sharon. Sorry to disturb you. There's a detective at the door. He wants to actually speak to you. He wants to establish that you're here. Sharon knew there would be no answer, and no answer came. She knocked again. Freya! Freya, it's me, Sharon! It's me, Sharon! It's important you answer the door! But there was no response. So reluctantly, she opened the door, a fiery heat rising from the pit of her belly, up her arms and her neck and face. At first the creaking door seemed to put up a little resistance. It was a heavy-built door. But soon the hulking presence of Detective Cox was reassuringly by her side. He took charge, pushing the heavy door open with a forceful jerk, and it obediently swung open on its hinges. The room was empty. Freya's bed was neatly made. There was a beautiful brightly coloured comforter spread across the bed, with a tapestry cushion against her puffed-up pillows that read, "Good night, sleep tight, don't let the bugs bite." There were a few of her clothes she'd worn during the week, lying sprawled over a laundry basket, and a top-of-the-range laptop computer opened out onto the desk, and beneath the desk was a wire dustbin, filled to the brim with crumpled pieces of paper. On Freya's nightstand was a framed picture of her with her family. They were all smiling widely into the camera lens, against an idyllic backdrop of trees. They were sporting glasses of champagne in their hands, as if celebrating a special event. Detective Cox walked over to the picture, picked it up in his hands, and studied it closely. He tapped a figure on the picture and showed it to Sharon. "Is this your roommate?" he asked her. Sharon studied the photograph and nodded, while Detective Cox physically stiffened. Everything about Freya's room was well ordered and neat. The room felt fresh and clean, but Sharon did not get the sense that Freya had been in the room for a long while. It was almost as if she knew that her roommate had not returned home to the apartment last night. Her stomach lurched. She suddenly felt quite queasy, as if the croissant she had recently ingested were threatening to make another less glamorous reappearance, and she didn't want this to happen in front of this very attractive-looking detective. She turned around to look at Detective Cox straight in the face. She wanted answers, and this man was not going to fob her off this time. "I don't understand it. Freya was supposed to come back last night, after she messaged me. You saw the message yourself. Why is she not here? Unless she left the apartment very early, and I never heard her leave. She's very discreet, you see," she said, her voice trailing off into a silent whisper, as of course Sharon knew that that was just wishful thinking on her part. The detective was silent for a brief moment and said nothing. Then Sharon impulsively burst out. "It's her, isn't it, Detective Cox? You found a body. It's my roommate. Please don't fob me off. I'm not stupid. I saw a body on a gurney being put into a white forensic van last night from my bedroom window. So I know we're dealing with a dead body here, aren't we, Detective? It's not Freya, is it?" "We have found a body, I'm afraid," said Detective Cox, looking at Sharon empathetically. "I believe it was your roommate, Freya Warrington." "Oh no! Oh no! That's terrible! She's dead! She's dead!" "I'm afraid so. I'm very sorry about this disheartening news. I am very sorry for your loss, ma'am. We did find her pink bag in the corridor. It was not located close to the body, so we weren't sure in the beginning if it actually belonged to the deceased or not. The purse and the bag confirmed the identification of the pink overnight bag as belonging to Freya Warrington. Now that you have shown me her photograph, it affirms to me that the woman we found slumped in the corridor was indeed your roommate." "Oh no! Oh no! That is just awful! I can't believe that, Detective! That's just terrible!" "One of the residents, a man called Red, found her propped up against the wall, lying in a crumpled heap. He said he thought she was drunk and inebriated, and had passed out in the corridor. He tried to wake her up to help her to return to the apartment, but that was when he saw the ligature marks around her neck. He knew she'd been strangled. I'm very sorry to be the bearer of such bad news. I can't imagine what it must be like to hear this.
It can't be easy for you.
Oh, she's been strangled. She was strangled.
I'm afraid so, ma'am.
You say Red found her? Asked Sharon. I have met that man. There's something about him, Detective, that I don't like. You don't think he did this to her, do you? I mean, he was the one that found the body. Don't they say you should always be suspicious of the first person who finds a dead body? That's what I've heard.
At this point, ma'am, we have no leads. But obviously we are investigating him, as he was the first person to find her. But we are not accusing anyone of this incident until our evidence points to a perpetrator.
But why her? Asked Sharon, her face crumpling up into sadness, her throat suddenly feeling dry. I just don't understand. Why would anybody want to hurt her? She seemed like such a nice person. I didn't know her terribly well, but nobody deserves this, Detective. This is absolutely insane. And to think it happened here in our apartment block. And the person who's living with me is now dead. I can hardly believe this. I've always felt incredibly safe living here. Until, of course, I bumped into that Red character in the lift. I thought he was rather dodgy. But beyond that, nothing untoward ever really happens here. People keep themselves to themselves. The place is quiet, unless Red brings along friends over to his apartment. They can be rather rowdy.
Well, that's the way it is with many crimes, ma'am. They sometimes occur in the most unlikely of places.
You're telling me, Detective? I'd have never imagined this happening here. I hope I'll be able to sleep after this.
Is there anything you can tell me, Sharon, about your roommate Freya Warrington? Anything that may be of interest? Has she had anyone visiting her here at the apartment? Or spoken to you perhaps about any boyfriend troubles? Is there anything you can tell me to shed light over this dreadful incident, perhaps?
Sharon shrugged her shoulders nonchalantly. I told you, Detective Cox. Freya kept herself to herself. I don't even know if she had a boyfriend, or if there was trouble in paradise. She didn't share anything with me. I mean, we had a brief conversation once when she first moved in. And when I interviewed her, as I wouldn't just accept any roommate, as you can appreciate, I always insist on references and that kind of thing, because you can never be too careful.
So you must have spoken to her at length when you were interviewing her, at least.
Well, not really, Detective. I don't know how to put it to you, but I think Freya was a very private person. Even when I talked to her, she was not terribly forthcoming. She's the type of person you'd probably have to know for many years before you got anything out of her. Even before my interview with her, I checked up her references, and no one had a bad word to say about her. So I was reasonably confident before she came over, even for the interview, that she'd likely be a suitable roommate.
So when did she move into your apartment, Sharon?
It was a month ago, Detective, not terribly long. My last roommate left because she was getting married. Her fiancé had rented a flat for them downtown. I was naturally sad to see her go because we were very good friends. But she was considerably older than I was, and was very eager to settle down. I needed to get a replacement as soon as I could, because I was hard-pressed to manage the rent on my own, as I'm afraid my savings are a little bleak, and I didn't want to ask the parents. The apartments here aren't cheap to rent, you see. My dad contributes to my rent every month, or I'd have to live somewhere else a lot less upmarket. I learnt about Freya looking for a place from a friend of a friend. It seemed to be a win-win situation, Detective. Referrals like that are gold dust, you see.
I imagine they are.
Well, when she came to see me, I liked her a lot. I instinctively knew I could trust her, and that's all I cared about. You see, I had a roommate once who pilferaged money from my purse. I thought I was losing my mind because my money kept vanishing. But I caught her stealing from me one day, rifling through my purse. So I kicked her out at once. You can't be too careful, Detective Cox, about the people you let into your apartment.
So what did Freya tell you about herself?
Well, let's see, said Sharon, trying to think back to the day that Freya had arrived at her doorstep, wearing jeans and a sweater, and looking at her through brown, frightened eyes, rather like a deer caught in headlights. Well, that's what she'd thought at the time. I do remember, Detective, that she was on edge at that interview, said Sharon. But I put it down to her, being anxious about it. She was eager to move in, you see, very eager, and was hoping I'd say yes. I thought she was reticently demure by nature, the type of person who likes to shrink in the background and hope you will never notice them, if you know what I mean. She told me she urgently needed to move in right away. She was a graphic designer, and she told me she wouldn't be any trouble at all. She was neat and tidy, and would be out a lot due to the demands of her job. I do know she was eager to move in, and when I gave her the green light within the hour, she arrived at the apartment with all her suitcases in the middle of the day. I do remember she looked somewhat flustered and relieved at the same time, as if a huge weight had been lifted off her shoulders. But I guess finding a roof over your head kind of does that to you. No one wants to be homeless, do they?
But where had she been living before? Do you know?
Oh, she said her living arrangements weren't working out for her. She said she wasn't getting along with her roommate, and then seemed to shut down, as if she'd said too much to me. I suspected she thought I'd be put off by her, if she was having issues with someone else, that I might think that I'd have issues with her as well. She didn't want me to think that she might be a difficult tenant, I suspect.
Did she tell you anything about her life in North Carolina?
Well, she told me she was a country girl. She'd grown up in the countryside, surrounded by the natural world. I think she said her father was in building construction. She loved her life in the countryside. They had horses, chickens and dogs, and at one stage her parents owned a pot-bellied pig called Podge, which was with the family for many years. She said he was the best garbage disposal you've ever seen. They loved him so much he was terribly affectionate. He grew enormous, and when he died the family was absolutely devastated. She told me they had a funeral for him, because that's how much he meant to them.
I've always rather fancied owning a pot-bellied pig myself, chuckled the detective. Got very good personalities, they have, and they're incredibly clean.
I have heard that somewhere.
Well, go on, will you?
She told me she was very close to her parents and her brother Stuart, who was a little older than she is. She loved living in the countryside, but her job had forced her to come to the city. But she liked to go home to be with her family as often as she could. She did think that city life was not really for her, but she was reasonably ambitious and needed to advance her career, so it was important for her to be based here.
You see, you do know something about her, said Detective Cox, looking reasonably pleased,
as he began to scribble down notes in his black book.
People often know a lot more than they think they do. You've told me quite a lot, ma'am.
Sharon! The name's Sharon. Don't call me ma'am.
This other place she was renting, do you know where it was, Sharon?
I'm sorry, Detective, I don't. I never asked her about it, but I'm sure it was closed.
Why do you say that?
Well, after the interview, I told her she could move in straight away, didn't I? And then within 20 minutes flat, and maybe even before that, she was here at the apartment with all her suitcases. I remember thinking she was an eager beaver, and I thought she couldn't have come from very far.
I see. You think she was trying to get away from this flatmate of hers?
Well, I don't know, Detective, but I do know her arrangement with him was not working out.
Him? You said she was sharing an apartment with a man?
Said Detective Cox, raising a brow. He appeared to have grown increasingly interested. Oh, didn't I say? Yes, he was a man. I think she said his name was, what was it? I'm just trying to think now. Barry Baldwin. Yes, that's right. Barry Baldwin it was. She said she was sharing a flat with this man, and she thought it was a bad idea because things had got out of hand. Yes, those were the words she used. She said things had got out of hand. Detective Cox scribbled down some more notes and looked up at Sharon.
Well, you've given me some good leads, Sharon. I appreciate that. I do need to speak to this Barry Baldwin character and find out what went wrong with his living arrangements when Freya was flat sharing with him.
You don't think he had something to do with this, do you, Detective? I mean, her being strangled?
The detective sighed. With any investigation, you can be grasping at straws. But in the end, we will find out who did this to her. You can be assured of that.
Are you sure you'll find the person who is responsible for this, Detective? It's just I've seen real-life crime dramas on television of unsolved cases that for years after, they never find the perpetrator.
I do not believe that is going to happen in this scenario. I am pretty sure, said Detective Cox assertively, that we shall find the perpetrator to this crime. I'm also confident that we found your roommate after you showed me her photograph. But I'm sure you can fully appreciate, Sharon, we do need a formal identification from you to affirm that the deceased is indeed your roommate.
Of course, Detective. I'll do anything I can to help, said Sharon, feeling decidedly sick at the very idea of identifying Freya Warrington, who had only lived with her for a month. But an identification would be needed, and she would do all she could to help in the circumstances, especially with the police investigation, so that Freya's killer could be found and brought to justice. It would seem another discomposing thought was now trespassing in her mind, as she kept thinking about Red, the thuggish-looking character she'd met in the lift, wearing a string vest covered in coffee stains. She had never forgotten the amorous way he had looked at her. There were no words to describe that intrusive look that he had given her, as if he was physically undressing her in his mind. If anyone had anything to do with Freya's death, she wouldn't be remotely surprised if it was him. If she was walking across a lonely street and encountered Red along the way, she would walk to the other side without question, because she'd be afraid he would mean her harm. Look, Detective Cox, I don't know how to say this to you, but I think Red might have something to do with Freya's death. The more I think about it, the more likely it seems.
You do? Asked Detective Cox, his jaw tightening. What makes you say this?
Well, yes, there's something about him, Detective Cox, that I don't like. He's, very grubby looking. He's a sleazebag. He gives me the creeps. He really does. The detective's lips began to twitch, as if he was trying to stop himself from smiling.
I get that a lot in my business, Sharon, I'm afraid. Just so you know, just because someone might look like they're capable of murder, does not mean they are. Looks can be very deceptive. I find that all the time. I will contact you in regards to the ID of Freya Warrington. I will also be in touch shortly. Also, just so you know, I will be sending police officers around to look through Freya's room to see if we can find any clues regarding who might have wished to cause her harm.
Of course, Sharon had said. You can come any time you like. I want to help in any way I can. I'm not a suspect, am I, Detective?
Everyone connected to Freya Warrington is a suspect. But you can take it from me, Sharon, that I think it's unlikely you had anything to do with your roommate's death.
Well, Detective, I don't know whether to be relieved or not, she said jokingly. 1 month later, Sharon had been somewhat startled by the phone call she'd received from Mrs. Warrington, who was speaking to her as if in some way she believed that Sharon had been a very close friend to her daughter Freya. Sharon would like to have corrected the woman and assured her that she had not known her daughter terribly well. But it did not seem like the right thing to say to a mother overwrought from grief, who was in need of as much comfort as she could possibly get.
"Oh, it's so good to finally speak to you, Sharon," said Mrs. Warrington. "My daughter told me all about you, you know. Of course, I didn't know your name at the time, but I do now. I'm so glad to be finally talking to someone who knew my daughter so well. She was quite the reticent character, wasn't she? But a kind of person you could never ever hope to meet. Our hearts feel so empty without her bright, cheery face around. She was the light of our lives, you know."
"I'm sure she was, Mrs. Warrington."
"Well, it goes without saying. Her loss has really devastated us all. I couldn't bear it when she came up to work and live in the city. But you know how it is. Your kids cannot be tied to your apron strings forever, can they?"
"Of course not, Mrs. Warrington. None of this was ever your fault."
"Well, you know, sometimes I wonder about that, dear. You see, I never had a good feeling about her leaving home. I tried to imagine her getting married one day, and I never could visualize it in my mind's eye, however hard I tried, and that troubled me greatly. It was like deep down in my gut, Sharon. I knew something bad was going to happen to my daughter, and that she would prematurely be taken from us. I even told my husband about my disconcerting feelings, and he told me I was being desperately silly. But the feeling never ever went away, you know. Maybe it's a mother's intuition.
Wow, that's incredible. I had no idea.
Well, I kept telling myself I was just being paranoid. When she told me she was moving in with you, she described you to us as being a very dear friend of hers. Well, let's just say it put my mind at ease. She never wanted to go to the city, you know, but she was so ambitious. So what could she do but chase after her dreams, and we needed to encourage her in that regard. She seemed to be loving her job. But what happened to her downstairs in your apartment block boggles my mind, and for the life of me, I can't understand. Who would do such a vindictive thing to my beautiful little girl?
Sharon could hear Mrs. Warrington sniffle and loudly blow her nose in a tissue. I'm so sorry, Mrs. Warrington. So sorry about your loss. I mean, there are no words, are there?
Thank you so much, Sharon. That's very kind of you,
said Mrs. Warrington, who was obviously suppressing sobs down the phone.
You do know the funeral was on hold for a whole month, due to the police investigation, and of course the coroner's report. But we're having the funeral next weekend, I'm glad to say. It's going to be quite serene as an event. Close friends and family, that sort of thing. Our Freya was a very private person, and we need to honour that. She'd have abhorred a big send-off of any kind. I'd love you to come along, as you were such a dear friend of hers, Sharon. I was wondering if I could ask you a very big favour. I hope I'm not being presumptuous.
But of course, Mrs. Warrington. I'd like to do anything I can to help.
It's Fanny, dear. You don't need to call me Mrs. Warrington. A friend of my daughter's is a friend of mine for life, and I look forward to finally meeting you. The whole family are eager in making your acquaintance.
That's kind of you to say, Fanny. Well, what can I do to help?
I wondered if you could pack up all Freya's things for me in a couple of suitcases and bring them along to North Carolina with you when you come up for the funeral. And I insist you stay over with us that weekend. It'll be the quintessential opportunity to get to know you better. We will pay all your travel both ways, of course, and the baggage costs for your flight. Do you think you can do that? Or if you choose to come up by car, which is an under 6-hour drive, we will cover petrol and rest stops for you along the way. I probably should have come up to your apartment myself in Atlanta, sorted her room out, but I just haven't got the energy to do it, I'm afraid. I just can't look through my daughter's stuff. It would break my heart. I'm emotionally spent. Anything that reminds me of Freya has me breaking out into tears. Beyond that, I don't want to see where she died. That would be just too distressing for words.
But of course, Fanny, I completely understand, and I'm more than happy to help. I'll pack all her stuff up in suitcases and bring it up myself to North Carolina for the funeral. I think I'll come up by car. The drive is not that daunting. It's easier to carry stuff that way in the trunk, if you know what I mean, than having to fuss about the weight of your stuff on those local flights. They can be quite pedantic, I find.
Oh, you are such a sweetheart, Sharon. Why am I not surprised you'd be willing to help? No wonder my daughter shared an apartment with you. You were a terribly good friend to her.
Sharon knew she should say something, but how could she? From what she'd gleaned, Freya had probably pretended to her family that she was moving in with a very good friend when she came up to Atlanta, so that she would get her parents off her back and stop them worrying about her so much. Young people did that all the time to ease their parents' worry, by saying things like, "Yes, I know the person I'm sharing a flat with, and one of them loves to cook, so I'll be eating well." That kind of thing. Sharon had seen it before, and had told a few white lies herself to her parents at times, given her mother was such a huge worrier, and was always panicking about whether Sharon was taking care of herself, living on her own. It was clear the Warringtons were protective over Freya, and she had probably believed a few white lies would allay their fears. The last thing Sharon wanted to do was to tell a grieving mother. No, I wasn't close to your daughter, and no, I don't actually believe she had any close friends. Or I think Freya said this to you, so you wouldn't worry about her. You can't say those kind of things to a grieving mother. It would be a cruel thing to do. Even though Sharon had not known Freya long, she was still melancholic about her loss, and if she needed to play the part that they were close, then that's what she would invariably do, for Freya's sake, of course. Sharon regretted that on the month that Freya had moved in with her, that she had not found out more about her rather reticent roommate. So there we are. That's the end of part 2 of our story. It's getting very exciting, heating up, that's for sure. And I look forward to you joining me tomorrow night. Until next time, goodbye.